Good morning to you, whether you're watching us on television or online. I'm Farah Nasser. We are awaiting the Prime Minister's daily address on Canada's fight against COVID-19. Here's a live look at Rideau Cottage. He's scheduled to speak outside in Ottawa shortly, and we'll take you there live once that happens. Now, testing, that remains key in tracking the spread of the virus. Some provinces doing much better than others. We're going to have more on that shortly because that's an important thing to talk about. But first, let's take a look at where the COVID-19 numbers stand right now, because we have passed several grim milestones, both globally and here in Canada. There are now more than 5.1 million known cases of the coronavirus around the world. 330,000 of those cases have been fatal. But well over 2 million people have now recovered from the virus. And in Canada, more than 80,000 people have now tested positive. And this is the difficult number. More than 6,000 Canadians have now died from COVID-19. Let's take a look at the number of infections, new infections that is, across the country today. British Columbia is seeing a spike in cases with 21 additional cases, and that's compared to just 2 the previous day. Ontario reporting just over 400 new cases today. And if you take a look at Quebec, it is reporting less than 600 new cases for 2 days in a row now. New Brunswick has not had a new case in 2 weeks, and you can see the number in Nova Scotia, 1 case there. Saskatchewan, meantime, is expanding its COVID-19 testing. Anyone working outside the home can now get tested. No symptoms are necessary. This move makes Saskatchewan's testing program the most expansive in our country right now. All other provinces, they require people to feel sick or to show symptoms before they can even qualify for a test. Quebec is loosening more of its COVID-19 restrictions. Starting tomorrow, gatherings of up to 10 people will be permitted. That's a maximum of 3 families, as long as there is, of course, that 2-meter distance from one another. And it's the same thing in Manitoba, but the numbers are even higher. Starting Friday there, up to 25 people can gather in a room and 50 if you gather outside. We have David Akin and Mike Lecouture, both from Ottawa, who will be providing analysis for us when the Prime Minister speaks. But we'll start with you, Mike. What is he expected to talk about today?
Expecting to make an announcement for off-reserve Indigenous peoples. We know that there has been a bunch of money that has been announced for Indigenous communities. Back in mid-March, they created the $305 million Indigenous Community Support Fund, but only $15 million of that was allotted for off-reserve organizations, even though that proportion of the population represents half of all Indigenous people in this country. So we're expecting an announcement there. And one of the reasons is because off-reserve Indigenous peoples often face difficulties because they live in big cities. There is increased homelessness, there is poverty, there is also food insecurity, mental health issues. So that is what the Prime Minister is expected to address. You've had the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, which represents about 90,000 off-reserve Indigenous people who have been asking for more money, saying these people are falling through the cracks, and it sounds like there will be an announcement on that today.
Okay, I want to bring you both in, David and Mike, on testing, because that has been such a key issue, and we've seen different provinces see different testing numbers. Ontario, and we'll start with you, David, has come under fire again for its low testing numbers. Why are they so low and so different from other provinces?
Yeah, so this is something Doug Ford said he wants to correct. He wants to get those testing numbers up. There has been, it seems, some sort of communication gaps, if you will, between testing authorities. There would be hospitals, local public health officials and the province, and that is something that the Premier in Ontario has been trying to fix. Saskatchewan all along has had the highest per capita testing rate. It's led the country from the wire here, followed closely behind by Alberta. Those are the two, 1 and 2. In fact, they've been testing at a rate for several weeks now, twice the rate of testing that's going on in Ontario. And as you mentioned, Saskatchewan now testing anybody, even with no symptoms, so long as you're working outside the home. And of course, the whole testing regime is going to be so important as we start to open up our economies and as we start to be able to, for example, visit people in retirement homes, not necessarily long-term care facilities, but retirement homes, which are also under lockdown. And people in those homes really are not told they're not allowed to leave, but if you were going to be going into those homes, presumably the availability of a test prior to that would be something you'd want to do. And many other job occupations. Can we have a test before I return to work? Now I feel safe. So testing is so crucial. And Ontario, as I say, has been trying to fix some problems with that. It's been mostly one of communication.
When we talk about our country as a whole, per capita testing is lower than many other countries. Has the federal government said that it would do anything to help these provinces, especially Ontario, when it comes to testing, Mike?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Prime Minister has said they tried to work in concert with all of the provincial governments to try and make sure that they have what they need for the testing. I mean, we saw that there was that setback with that Spartan Cube, the serological test, that many thought could have helped, especially in remote regions, because those tests don't need to go back to a city center to a major testing lab. But in terms of what the federal government can do, surely the Prime Minister is going to be talking about this today when he has his regular phone call teleconference with all the premiers and territorial leaders and asking where they are in their testing, what needs to be done and what more help they can do. But I think the Prime Minister is also in a difficult position where healthcare, even though this is a national pandemic and a global pandemic, whereas he would maybe like to tap a couple of them or help nudge them along a little bit, he's in a bit of a difficult position because he can't tell them what to do. He can't tell them to ramp them up. He can't mandate that there's more. That is all part of the national guidelines that all provinces and territories have come to the agreement of, which is we will only open up our economies if our testing level is at a certain level. Interesting to note that, Ontario, while they are below what they want to be, Doug Ford has said that he wants to be at about 20,000 tests per day, and they are not there. Just some of the stats that we've seen recently, 7,382. That's what we heard yesterday from the previous day, and then the previous day to that, only 5,800. And that was, after a big blitz over the weekend, testing a lot of those long-term homes, the residents, and a lot of the staff as well. So it's interesting, though, that the economies and the provinces continue to open up, even though the testing level is not still there. So I wonder whether or not they are sort of going ahead of schedule if they're not meeting the testing capacity that they all had agreed to.
Let's bring in now Ross Lord on this conversation too. He joins us from Halifax. And Ross, we've seen in the East Coast the numbers are low. In fact, we're hearing of two provinces that might even have provincial bubbles because they're doing so well. What is the testing capacity like there? And talk to us about the Maritimes and what we're seeing in terms of reopening the economy.
Well, the testing capacity varies. Nova Scotia has a very high capacity, New Brunswick a bit less, although New Brunswick has been the shining star in even a national context in terms of preventing the virus from gaining a foothold. But here in Nova Scotia, you could call it an abundance of caution. The number of positive cases is way down recently, and there's growing pressure to remove restrictions. There has been some loosening of physical distancing, beaches open, more shopping malls, day surgeries are beginning on Monday, but there's still a strong tone from authorities of restraint here, messaging that there needs to be very few or no cases for at least 2 weeks before they really open things up. We should note, though, that Nova Scotia had no cases until after other provinces had reported the virus. So the Premier and health authorities say the go-slow approach makes sense, especially with the probability of a second wave. And they refer to some countries which have opened up the economy and then had to reimpose restrictions because there were signs the virus was re-emerging.
Let's zero in on that PEI model with New Brunswick in terms of having this bigger bubble. Talk to us about how that would work.
Well, as we mentioned, New Brunswick is the shining star in terms of preventing COVID-19. It has 93% fewer confirmed cases per capita than the national average, so it's ahead of many provinces in reopening. PEI has also been successful, and it's now allowing seasonal residents to apply to travel back to their summer cottages in early June. So those two provinces are musing aloud about forming what they are calling a regional travel bubble, which, along with encouraging more freedom of movement for residents, could also provide a bit of damage control for the tourism industry, which is looking at what could be a really dismal season.
Certainly, and I know Canadians, of course, looking forward to the summer, seeing where they could travel, what provinces will be open, and how travel will change. Let's actually bring in all three of you to talk about this, and that is the discussion on masks. We heard the Prime Minister talk about how the shift was going to happen with masks. We saw him wear a mask, but this really has been a debate when it comes to wearing masks, not wearing masks. Let's start with you, David, on why Theresa Tam has changed the directive when it comes to masks.
Well, she got asked that very question yesterday at a regular press conference, and here's what she's saying. First off, the wearing of a mask is to prevent other people from getting infected. It does nothing to prevent you from getting infected if it's just a regular old cloth mask. You're protecting other people. And here's the situation that Dr. Tam described. Scientists do not know exactly how the virus is being transmitted from people with no symptoms, people who are asymptomatic. We still haven't figured out how that is exactly working. And so wearing a cloth mask, if you feel like a healthy person, you may have it, and this is preventing you from spreading it. So it's an additional layer of protection. And that's an important adjective there, additional layer of protection, washing hands, all those things. Now, the second thing Dr. Tam was asked is, well, if it's an additional layer of protection, why not make it mandatory? Why not just tell everyone in the country, hey, if you're going out, you got to wear a mask? And her point was that is not the federal government's role when it comes to helping reduce the spread or reducing transmission. That is the role, though, of local health authorities or people who are operating certain kinds of services. So, for example, it is mandatory if you get on a plane in Canada that you have to wear a mask. That's Transport Canada's rule, saying everybody, you got to wear a mask. Now, so far, we haven't seen transit authorities across the country make it mandatory to get on a subway or a bus. The Union for the Toronto Transit Commission, the country's biggest, has recommended it, but right now the TTC and many other transit authorities, quote, strongly recommending you wear a mask. There has been an issue that some people cannot wear a mask. They have some other respiratory problems. It makes it difficult to breathe, and so that may be behind it. But you could see a situation where there's, say, an outbreak in this city or that city, and a local public health authority says, right, it's now mandatory. Everybody has to wear masks. So this is going to evolve, this whole discussion about whether or not to wear a mask. Right now, from Dr. Tam's standpoint, she's no longer suggesting, she is, quote, recommending. So if you're going out and you can't maintain that 2-meter distance, time to put a cloth mask on. But more importantly, you're going to see some businesses, you're going to see some agencies, and you're going to see local health authorities maybe have slightly different mask rules. And I think that's something everybody's going to have to prepare for and be ready to adjust to.
Yeah, David, let's bring in Mike on that, because there are some businesses already where it's mandatory, where you have to wear a mask. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I mean, there are some grocery stores, such as the T&T grocery stores. I know we have a couple here in Ottawa or around the country as well, where you can't walk in without a mask on. And, certain Costco locations, I've heard that you can't go in without a mask as well. And to David's point, it's an additional, and what Dr. Tam said, it's an additional precaution. Let's put it this way. You put on a mask and you walk into a store, no gloves, nothing else, and you just walk around touching everything and every surface, and then you go home and put your fingers in your eyes, your nose, or your mouth. Well, guess what? That mask hasn't really done a whole heck of a lot. Now, has it? The other question is whether or not people, and I think this is a reason why Dr. Tam doesn't want to mandate it or doesn't feel comfortable mandating it across the board as well, is what about people who aren't wearing the mask properly? I've seen, on a number of occasions, people with it just over their mouths, not over their noses as well. So I think that there is a whole host of considerations that are going on here on, whether or not they can. And to David's point, it's not in the purview of the federal government to say that we are doing it across the country. But I think that health officials are also looking at this and saying, how likely is it that we can actually get everybody to follow this? For instance, the, self-isolation model and saying everybody has to stay home. You would have to think that it's at a certain point behind closed doors, there are discussions saying, we know that if we set the bar up here, 90% of Canadians are only actually going to get to here, and we need them here. So let's say that it has to be this stringent and make sure that we know that they're actually getting to the lower bar. And that's potentially what we're hearing as well now. I mean, it's just interesting to see the messaging and to see a lot of the concern over the messaging because people are questioning Dr. Tam and asking whether or not she's changing her mind when the science behind it is changing so much. And knowing that this this virus is evolving so much, and that's why it does seem like it's a bit of a moving target, and why some of the advice continues to change and alter a little bit, especially as different provinces start to reopen. When everybody was in lockdown, one could argue didn't really need a mask because there weren't that many people around you. But the point has always been the mask is a non-medical mask, is to protect you from spreading it to others. So in essence, if everybody wears them, then we're all protecting ourselves against each other. And that was what Dr. Tam said yesterday. That's when it's effective. It's not effective if you only have half the population or little bits and pieces here.
Your mask protects me, my mask protects you. I know the concern, we're looking at the cottage, the Rideau Cottage door because the Prime Minister is just about to come out. But just to outline some of the concerns people had with masks, and these were medical experts, Mike, it was, are we wearing these masks properly? There's a certain way to wear them. We don't have a culture of wearing masks. Are we touching them too much? So a lot of questions still surrounding masks, and it will evolve the directive. Here is the Prime Minister now.
Good morning, everyone. The first thing I want to talk about today is what we're doing to support Indigenous people during the pandemic. Since day one, our government has been engaging with First Nations, Inuit and Métis Nation leaders in the fight against this virus. We've been listening to people's concerns and working with local leadership to ensure that communities are getting the right support. And so far, we've taken a number of important steps. We're investing in emergency shelters to help Indigenous women and children fleeing violence. We're offering interest-free loans and non-repayable contributions to help Indigenous businesses weather this storm. We're helping First Nations, Inuit and Métis Nation students and recent grads find a job this summer. And last week, we announced more funding to support the most urgent needs of Indigenous communities dealing with the COVID-19 outbreak. While all communities have had to wrestle with COVID-19 these past few months, the everyday realities of this crisis are different for everyone. To mount an effective response to this crisis, we must adapt our approach and our programs to recognize and meet the particular needs of all Indigenous peoples, including those living in urban areas and off-reserve. To this end, we announced $15 million back in March to support Indigenous organizations that deliver services to these populations as part of the Indigenous Community Support Fund we had set up to help prevent and mitigate the impact of this virus. With this money, organizations have been able to give meals, groceries, clothing and supplies to those in need and offer mental health counselling. They've also provided personal protective equipment and cleaning supplies for supportive housing and computer and laptops so kids can keep up with their schoolwork. This funding is helping vulnerable people like youth, women, and elders. Indigenous community organizations in our cities and off-reserve do crucial work year-round, but these days their services are in high demand because of the pandemic. We need to make sure they have the resources to adapt and grow their services so they can fulfill their important mission. So today, our government is announcing an additional $75 million in new funding for organizations that address the critical needs of the over 1 million Indigenous people living in urban centres and off-reserve. This is critical work. If you live off-reserve or in a city, we're working to make sure you don't fall through the cracks. You need and deserve services that are culturally appropriate, and that's what we're doing with today's investment. Aujourd'hui, notre gouvernement annonce un nouvel investissement de...
Our government announces today a further additional investment of $75 million for the most pressing needs of the more than 1 million Indigenous living outside the reserves and in urban centers for the purpose of fighting food insecurity, help elders, aid young people at risk, provide mental health services, and prevent family violence or domestic violence. I want now to speak to employers and business owners. A lot has been said about the future reopening of the economy these days, which is a good thing for everybody. But if you have been forced to slow down or even stop your activity, your business, over the last few months, you have many challenges to overcome. This is why we provide those measures to help you. If you need help to hire your own employees, you can use the emergency wage subsidy, which has been extended to the end of the summer. If you have problems of cash flow, or if you have expenses, you can receive a loan through the emergency business account. And if you're not eligible for those two programs, I suggest you talk to your regional development agency, which should be able to help you. We also work in cooperation with the provinces and territories for the purpose of lowering the rents for small businesses, and landlords will be able, as of next Monday, ask for a loan on the CMHC website. We all look forward to having our economic activities resuming, but everybody should his own share, and there is an important role to be played by landlords. And so if you want to go back to normalcy, one of the first things that one has in mind is to go back to work and to resume some financial stability, to see their friends again, and their colleagues again, and go back to their routine. So your employees are counting on you, so does your community. So if you need some help, but you don't know where to start off, go to the site Canada.ca and look at the page dedicated to COVID-19, and you will learn a lot about the various programs available and how you can get some support. Our government is here to help you. We are already preparing the new activities, and we will be working together when the crisis is finished.
To follow public health instructions. COVID-19 remains a very serious health threat. Yesterday, Dr. Tam said that whenever physical distancing is not possible, Canadians should wear a non-medical mask or face covering when they go out. I want to remind everyone that physical distancing means keeping a 2-meter distance with others. As we start to reopen the economy, it might be more difficult to maintain that distance at all times, so please follow Dr. Tam's advice. Keep washing your hands, stay home, and if you need to, wear a mask. This is the best way to protect both yourself and others. Alors qu'on commence à rouvrir
As
graduellement
we
l'économie,
are gradually reopening our economy, we shouldn't forget that COVID-19 remains a serious threat for health. And yesterday, Dr. Tam said that Canadians should be wearing a non-medical mask when they cannot keep a distance of 2 meters with other people. As we are reopening our economy, it might be difficult to comply with such directive of 2 meters. So please do continue to keep that distance, wash your hands, and if necessary, do wear a mask. This is the best way to protect our own health and that of other people.
more than 230 new officers are graduating from the Royal Military College of Canada. They are part of a new generation of exceptional women and men ready to serve our country with distinction. You have chosen to step up and serve your country, and we could not be more proud of you. Thank you for your example. Thank you for your dedication. Thank you for your love of this extraordinary country, and mostly, thank you for everything you will do for us in the coming years. Congratulations to the class of 2020. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Premier ministre.
Thank you. Thank you, Prime Minister. We'll start the phone questions today.
Janie Pashagumskum, APTN, line open.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. This question, I know I talked about it yesterday, about communities, about Indigenous communities protecting their members, specifically in Manitoba's Kiosk Dam. You have Fox Lake creating another blockade. And I'm wondering, do you think, specifically Fox Lake, do they have the right to protect their community members like this?
I think every community needs to make sure they're taking decisions to protect their members, but I think there are many ways of going about it. We need to make sure that all different orders of government, including Indigenous governments, are working together with the same goal, which we all share, which is keeping Canadians as safe as possible, recognizing that certain communities and certain individuals are more vulnerable. And I certainly know that across the country there have been excellent and constructive conversations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous leadership in areas of overlap so that we can move forward in a way that protects Canadians but also allows for a progressive return to normality. I
believe that it is extremely important for all communities to take all the necessary decisions for the purpose of guaranteeing the security and the safety of our citizens. And I believe that there are in the country Indigenous and non-Indigenous adjacent communities which are discussing the best modalities and best ways of protecting their own populations. And we all share the same desire to be able to check any spread of COVID-19 and particularly to protect our most vulnerable citizens.
Yes, thank you. And again, I know I spoke to you about this yesterday, but my next question is again concerning early releases of prisoners. And more specifically, we at APTN, we've been asking Bill Blair for about a month now for the number of released inmates that have been released early from federal prisons. We've been trying quite unsuccessfully. But I'm wondering, do you have, can you confirm that inmates are being released early? And do you know when we'll get these numbers?
Corrections Canada has from the very beginning taken extremely seriously the responsibility of keeping both inmates and staff safe in their institutions during this pandemic. They have taken a number of steps in terms of reducing mobility between prisons, increasing the access for protective measures, and in certain cases looking at release conditions. Minister Blair will have more to answer on that.
Thank you. Operator, next question.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Stuart Thompson, National Post. Line open.
Hi, Prime Minister. Thanks for taking the question. I'm just hoping to get a sense of your government's thinking around a potential second wave of infections in the fall. I know there's some concern in provincial governments that Canadians might not take to a second lockdown or maybe even a third or a fourth if it comes to that. Could be for mental health reasons or economic security reasons or just a kind of exhaustion. So I'm just curious, is this something that you are also worried about?
I think one of the things we know is that in pandemics there are usually second waves. The question that we're very much focused on is as that second wave begins or as we start to see resurgences in a reopened economy, how quickly are we able to contain them and control them? And that comes down to the scale of testing, the scale of contact tracing we're able to have right across the country. That's why the federal government has stepped up in its offer to provinces to support them in massively scaling up testing capacity and contact tracing capacity. We know particularly in those areas that are still working to get the spread of the virus under control, it is going to be important to increase testing now as we're seeing in those areas, but also make sure that as we move forward through the summer and obviously into the fall, we are ready to act extremely quickly so that the population at large won't be in situations of having to go back into confinement. But that depends on citizens doing their part. It also depends on having that testing capacity, and that's what we're moving forward on.
As a follow-up, Stuart?
Yeah, so there have been some countries that even in the first wave have managed to fend off a large amount of infections without a lockdown. I'm thinking of Hong Kong, where they've had barely any deaths, and it's mainly because of mask wearing and a really robust centralized quarantine. And I'm curious if your government has been exploring these other jurisdictions and maybe some other ideas that would allow you to hold off on a lockdown if infections do raise again?
From the very beginning, we have been looking carefully at what other countries have done and drawing from them on elements that we could put forward in our response that would help here in Canada. Obviously, there are many lessons. Many countries around the world got serious in their situations before we did, so we were able to make some very smart choices early on that has largely kept the pandemic within controllable levels in Canada, although there have still been far too many deaths, and we certainly grieve and mourn all of those. We know that there is more to do, and as we reopen, we know that citizens will continue to be extremely vigilant and careful about how they act, because that is going to be a key part of keeping us safe moving forward. So government will do its part. Citizens, employers, employees will be doing their part. We need to continue to do everything we can to prevent the need for any further lockdowns the way we've had up till now. Nous avons depuis le début regardé ce que les autres pays.
From the outset, we have been looking at what other countries do so that we could see what measures could be applied in Canada. We have adapted measures taken overseas to our own circumstances, of course. As we move to a more open and active economy, we will need to continue remaining vigilant as a government. We need to maintain an increased screening capacity and contact tracing capacity. We do, at the same time, expect everyone to do their part. We know that people don't want to have to go backwards. They don't want to have to isolate again and lock down again. So it's important for people to wear masks, maintain distancing, wash their hands regularly, be careful at work. Employers have to do their part. All of these aspects will be crucial in managing and containing a second wave without having to go back to the lockdown we've had for the past 2 months. Next question. Hello. I'd like some comments on private camps and day camps. Many believe that without financial assistance from the federal government, they will have to shut down. But economic activity is restarting. Are you going to help these camps? I think that away camps and day camps will, like any other organizations, have to make their decisions with the priority, of course, being on the safety of clients and staff. A lot of economic sectors will be in difficulty this summer because because of the tourists who won't be there, because of the trips that are being made, because of COVID-19. Federal, provincial, and territorial governments will have to reflect on ways to avoid damaging our economy too much, since after the pandemic we will want to be back full steam ahead. Yes, but to what extent do you believe that these camps are important as the economy reopens, not only for the children, not only for the teenagers who work in them, but also for the parents? As criteria loosens, these camps could be helped to hire a higher number of monitors. Are you ready to provide that assistance? I think that each region will have to consider its own circumstances. COVID is spreading more, would be spreading more in places like institutions that are more physically closed, where people work close together. These are aspects that will have to be considered. Camps will have to be reopened very carefully. I don't know what decisions the regions will arrive at, but I do know that people are under a lot of pressure from parents who want to send their children to camp, but who are concerned about their children's health and safety at the same time. these are all considerations that will have to be reflected upon in the coming days and weeks. Thank you. Hélène Buzetti, Le Devoir. Good morning, Mr. Trudeau. I'd like to come back to airlines. Recently, Air Canada had about $2.6 billion in fares that had been sold and would not be refunded. Is your government going to make assistance to airlines conditional on the extent to which they refund their passengers? A lot of Canadians have been concerned about tickets they have bought that they will not be using. We recognize how vulnerable the airline sector is and the challenges they're facing at the same time. However, we also understand the economic concerns of Canadians. We will work with airlines and with Canadians who are concerned with finding solutions.
Impacted air travel and airlines are by this COVID-19 pandemic. We also recognize that many Canadians are out of pocket for tickets that they are obviously not going to be using. I think we need to have some very careful discussions with airlines, with the air travel sector, and indeed with Canadians who are concerned to try and figure out a way forward where we can ensure that Canadians are treated fairly, and our airline industry remains there for when our economy picks up again.
Mais donc j'entends ce que vous me dites, mais pourriez-vous être un peu plus clair? Vous dites que vous allez chercher des solutions.
Could you please be a bit clearer? You say you're going to look for solutions. Does that range of solutions involve requiring airlines to refund unused tickets? We are looking at what other countries are doing. We are talking to the airlines. We are listening to Canadians' concerns because Canadians want their money back when they haven't been able to take trips. On the other hand, they also want there to be an airline industry in the future. So finding the right balance is going to be crucial.
Want to make sure they're not out of pocket, but they also want to know that we do have a future for our airline industry in Canada. It's an important thing for Canadians to continue to have airlines in this country. We need to make sure we're getting that balance right, and we're making it through this in the right way.
Hi, Prime Minister. Tom Perry, CBC. We've seen some shortfalls in testing in places like Ontario and Quebec. You've just said that the federal government offering to invest in a national framework to lead the way on testing and contact tracing. You've got a call with the premiers today. Presuming if they do take you up on your offer, how fast could you roll this out? What's standing in your way? And given the shortfalls we're seeing in places like Ontario and Quebec, should they feel safe as these economies reopen?
We have already seen significant ramp-ups of testing in places like Ontario and Quebec, where there is a need for even greater testing. Last week with the premiers, I laid out that offer that the federal government could take it on, and we got positive responses from right across the country. We're going to continue discussing that tonight and talk precisely about how we can scale up testing immediately in places where it's necessary, like in Ontario and Quebec, and be ready to scale up almost instantly in places where right now the virus is pretty well under control, but any flare-ups need to be responded to extremely quickly. That is the frame that we're laying out. We don't want logistical or financial limitations to keep anywhere in this country held back from doing all the testing that is necessary. That's what the federal government will be there for. Nous savons qu'on a besoin de faire plus de dépistage.
We know we need to do more screening. We know we need to do more contact tracing, particularly in Quebec and Ontario. However, I'd point out that there has been a huge ramp up in the number of tests administered recently, and we will continue keeping that trajectory. It is important to increase the screening rate, and the federal government will provide the resources and equipment needed to achieve that, as we have been doing for weeks, in fact. but they're different situations. For example, at present in Quebec and Ontario, we need to do more testing right away. In other parts of the country, where the need is not there at present because things are under control, that doesn't mean, however, that they may not need to ramp up the number of tests very quickly should there be a fresh outbreak. The federal government will be there to help provinces.
Policy on paid sick leave says it's a crucial part of preventing that second wave of COVID-19. You've got economies opening up. You've got a lot of low-wage workers finding it hard to take sick leave. So would you be willing to look at a national policy on that?
We have already had good conversations on a range of proposals by the provinces. I've heard John Horgan, Premier of BC, directly on this proposal, and look forward to continuing conversations with the provinces on how we can best support people. There's the issue of sick leave. There's the issue of increased childcare spaces. There's the issue of making sure our long-term care facilities are better supported and more protected. There are a number of things that we need to talk about as governments to ensure that we're moving forward in the right way.
Prime Minister Janet Silver, Global News. Canada's spy agency CSIS is warning of a national risk posed by foreign investments. Plus, there are threats from foreign actors to manipulate the Canadian public and interfere with our democracy. I'm wondering, how concerned are you about these reports, and what actions are your government taking to mitigate these concerns?
Our national security agencies do an exceptional job in flagging risks to Canadians and taking action to mitigate those risks. We will always support them and take on their recommendations and make sure that we are doing everything we can to protect Canadians from malicious actors, whether they be foreign or domestic. Nos agences de sécurité et de renseignement font un travail exceptionnel.
Our intelligence and security agencies do excellent work in highlighting threats to our country and taking action when necessary. Our government always applies their recommendations and works with them so that we can ensure that our systems and our people are protected.
To China's ambassador to Canada. And when we asked him about the detainment of the two Michaels detained in China, Michael Spavor and Michael Korvic, he said that they were being treated very well. And then he went on to say, and I quote, that actually the biggest issue in our bilateral relationship is still Meng Wanzhou case. So that's why we have made it our position very clear, to make sure that she's back in China smoothly and safely. So the ambassador has linked her case to the two Michaels. I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
We have seen Chinese officials linking those two cases from the very beginning. Canada has an independent judicial system that functions without interference or override by politicians. It is one of the things that is deeply dear to Canadians in our system to keep it strong and assure the division of powers within our democracy. China doesn't work quite the same way and don't seem to understand that we do have an independent judiciary from political intervention. We will continue to follow and uphold the independence of our judicial system while we advocate for the release of the two Michaels who have been arbitrarily detained by China in retaliation for a judicial system that is independent in the way it functions. Le Canada a un système judiciaire.
Canada has a fully independent judicial system that is free of political interference. That is not entirely the case in China, so they don't understand that we don't have the ability or even the desire to interfere in our independent judicial system. It is very important for us to defend our values and democratic principles. We will always do so. So the fact that China continues to link a judicial process which is independent to the case of Meng Wanzhou and links that to the arbitrary detention of two Canadians is unfortunate, but it is a challenge that we have been working on for over a year now. Louis Blouin, Radio-Canada. there have been dozens of cases of identity theft, of fraud, fraudsters using identity theft to open bank accounts and claim the CERB through those fraudulent bank accounts. What can you do in the short term to prevent fraud of that kind? We quickly understood that we had to act swiftly to help the millions of Canadians who'd lost their jobs because of COVID-19, who were simply not going to have enough money to buy groceries, pay the rent. This was an emergency. So we set up measures that would enable us to roll out those emergency benefits very quickly to 8 million and more Canadians who have already received it. In so doing, we knew that there was a chance that some people would like to commit fraud and game the system. So we did not put in measures to screen them out before the benefits were paid, but we have set up measures to detect people committing fraud and recovering the money as the pandemic continues. I can assure you that the Canadian Revenue Agency and public servants are taking measures to recover the money that has been disbursed fraudulently. Some Mohawk are blockading Oka. Is this acceptable? We all have the same goal in mind. We want to protect our people from COVID-19. We want to ensure their health and safety, particularly for vulnerable people. Different levels of government, including Indigenous governments, have to work together so that we can make appropriate decisions that do protect people, even as we try to move slowly back to a semblance of normality. I do think the leaders of various communities should be able to agree on how to move ahead.
We understand we all want the same thing. Every different order of government wants to ensure that citizens, particularly our vulnerable elders and vulnerable citizens, are protected. That's why different orders of government, including Indigenous governments, need to work with nearby communities and ensure that we're finding a balance that protects the citizens first and foremost, but allows for the careful reopening as appropriate of our economies and our communities.
Glenn McGregor, CTV News. Prime Minister, I want to ask you about the airline tickets again, because your two previous responses were not clear. The federal government is the regulator of Canada's airlines. Will you use that power and authority over them to insist the people who paid for tickets and were not given refunds get those refunds?
This is an important issue to Canadians that we are working with the airlines and with Canadians concerned on. We're looking at what other countries have done in these measures, and we're looking to make sure that Canadians are supported financially through this time, but that also we're going to come back with airlines that function here in Canada for the long term. Getting that balance right will be delicate, but it is something that we're working on.
But, Prime Minister, don't you see this as fundamentally unfair that people bought tickets, may never be able to use them, and are now given vouchers instead that they can't use? Don't you just think it's a matter of fairness and it's the right thing to do, whatever the issues the airline industry is facing right now?
This is why we are working with all concerned parties to try and find a solution. Merci tout le monde.
Merci.
Thank you, everyone.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau speaking outside Rideau Cottage, not giving any specifics to a question many have had who have bought plane tickets and now have a voucher to take a flight somewhere where, well, right now nobody's taking flights anywhere. So again, no specifics on that. But let's focus on one of the key things that came out of that in this press conference with Mike LeCouture and David Akin, and that is regarding testing. I want to get both your perspectives on this. Trudeau was asked about the potential for a second wave, and he said increased testing is key to keep numbers down. We all know that. But we are at less than half the capacity here in Canada, according to our Chief Medical Officer of Health, when it comes to testing. So how can the federal government help this? Mike, I'll start with you.
Yeah, and he mentioned that he will be talking about that this evening in that call with the premiers to make sure that the federal government is helping to support them and to make sure that if they do need the help to scale up that testing, that the federal government is there in whatever way possible. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not it is one of these things where the federal government tries to push a little more on the provinces, lean on them a little more. He says that they're continually there to help support, and especially I think it was interesting to note that he wants to make sure the testing capacity is there in places where he says that the virus seems to be a little more under control, possibly a little nod to the maritime provinces where, you know, as Ross had mentioned before the Prime Minister spoke, that, you know, the New Brunswick is seen as the sort of the shining star of the country, or at least the Atlantic region, in that kind of testing and keeping the virus under control. You know, exactly how the government will do it, either making tests available. We saw early on in the pandemic, you know, moving around some of the actual testing kits and seeing that whether or not can we move them from the Atlantic provinces to help Quebec and Ontario, who are having a little more trouble. It'd be interesting to see what comes out of that and how that conversation evolves in trying to prod all of these different provinces and getting the testing back up to a level that even the Prime Minister said has to match how we reopen our economy as we go forward, recognizing that if we don't have the testing capacity, then we can't reopen economies. So how that conversation will evolve this evening and exactly what kind of support that the government can provide, the federal government, will be interesting to see.
The other question is, I mean, how did we get here? Because when you look at this from an outside point of view, and I'll bring in David for this, I mean, testing should have been key from the beginning. And when we look at Ontario and how far behind Ontario is and just can't seem to get it right, how did we even get here when we knew the testing was key from the beginning, David?
Well, one of the issues in Ontario's case, just to be specific about that, was communication, and communication in this sense, that there was, it was not clear who should be tested. Should it be people who had symptoms? At one point, yes. At one point, no. Should it be people who had symptoms and were known to have come into contact with someone who had been diagnosed with COVID-19? Those instructions were interpreted different ways by frontline healthcare workers. So that's one issue. Another has been, in fact, procurement, and this is where the federal government plays a big role. The federal government, for example, is trying to buy enough swabs, for example, that are used for the testing procedure. Some from international sources, and we do know of at least one batch of swabs that arrived from an offshore supplier in China that were infected themselves, that were not sterile, and so that had to be batched out. So again, it's a little bit different depending on which region of the country you're in, which test you're getting, but more importantly, what sorts of instructions were given to the frontline workers who are administering these tests.
Anything else that you got out of today's press conference, David, that we should be paying attention to?
Well, I did note that he did have a long section in French where there was a message for business owners and specifically landlords. And just in case you weren't catching up on the translation, I think it is important to underline that yesterday and again today, the Prime Minister is putting the onus on the country's commercial landlords to do the right thing and make sure that your small business tenants who've been forced to shut down for a couple of months. That's what we asked of restaurants and stores, shut down in the name of public health. They've had no revenue, they've had no way to pay their rent. And so Trudeau's saying to landlords, you need to be sympathetic about that and look at applying for the commercial rent relief program. Yesterday, the Prime Minister announced that relief program begins to take applications on May 25th. The controversy here is it's landlords who have to apply to get relief for their tenants' rents. So a landlord applies, landlord gets a 50% forgivable loan for the tenant's rent. The tenant has to pay 25%. But the landlord then is on the hook for the other 25%. So landlords have been saying to us, to business groups, I'm not going to apply for this program because it means I'm automatically out by 25%. So the Prime Minister saying, no, wait a minute, you've got to make sure everybody comes through this. Part of the loan a landlord could get could be forgivable, so that means a landlord is sort of back in the black a bit. But it looks like it's going to have to be moral suasion at this point to get landlords to participate. The Prime Minister's words are pretty measured. For I know you were probably listening to Doug Ford earlier this week, the Premier of Ontario, when he talked about greedy landlords. That was his phrase, that he didn't want to see greedy landlords taking advantage of small business owners, and he might do something about it. We don't know what he'll do, but there's now politicians trying to essentially force landlords to ease up some rent. And how serious is this? Well, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business surveyed its small business members, and they found 50% do not think they'll be able to pay June's rent, and 20% fear they'll be evicted. So this is a big problem.
Yeah, that's clearly an issue for a lot of people. Let's bring in Michael Couture. Now, Mike, you have been looking at the airline sector specifically, and there were questions posed to the Prime Minister about that. Anything new on that front?
I thought it was really interesting how he phrased those answers, because the question came on multiple times, first in French and then in English, on what happens to these consumers who maybe have bought tickets and they have not been fully refunded, but instead they've been given these travel vouchers that what can you do with, because we don't know whether or not airline travel will be something that a lot of people do in the near future. And he continued to say that he's working with consumer groups, he's talking to Canadians, talking to the airlines as well, and while he wants to protect consumers, and I'm just going to look at my notes for a second. He said they don't want to be out of pocket, but at the same time, we want to make sure there are airlines after all of this. So clearly, he's feeling some pressure from Air Canada and other airlines to make sure that the government, which, as David had said, Transport Canada does manage a lot of these airlines, manage in terms of the rules and regulations around them, that clearly there is some pressure being felt on this government to not force them to give refunds back, so that Canadians are now holding on to these travel vouchers, even though their trip was canceled as a result of COVID-19. So it's interesting how he continued to say that he wants to make sure that there is still airlines around after all of this, clearly feeling that pressure from the airlines who are saying, just the example, Air Canada on Friday said they were going to lay off 20,000 employees. So there is that pressure there on the government to not act too swiftly, not to come down too hard on them in trying to force them to give those refunds, because the airline industry, clearly feels it's at a tipping point here.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. That is Michael Couture and David Aiken, both joining us from Ottawa. We want to end the show with Ross Lord. Ross joins us from Halifax. And Ross, what I want to ask you about specifically is, beyond this pandemic, Nova Scotians have been dealing with several other tragedies. What is the mood like? How is the province coping right now?
Farah, it's hard to find the words. It is fair to say, and it might even be an understatement to say that, Nova Scotians, we are still reeling from the mass shootings, the Navy helicopter crash, followed by the Snowbirds crash. All of these gut-wrenching episodes stacked on top of the pandemic and the tension that everyone in Canada was already feeling. You hear people say that they'd rather forget about 2020 and the year's not even half over yet. But on the other hand, the weather is improving, warming up, restrictions are gradually being lifted. So there's increasing hope that this year, the rest of this year, has got to be better than the way it started.
We're looking at pictures of faces, people who were killed, and of course that mass shooting. And then it happened, the helicopter crash, and of course this latest incident, the Snowbirds crash as well. And it's just, I know, Ross, it's so easy to say Canada is with you, Canada is thinking about you, but it's just so unimaginable right now what the province is going through. It just feels like it's been especially hard hit right now. And I'm sure there are some stories of goodness, of people coming together as well out of this.
Yeah, there are a lot of stories, and you already had a sense of that when the pandemic started, when the lockdown started, and a lot of people turned to the tried and true customs, especially music, to try to get through it. These virtual house concerts and other sort of expressions and ways of comforting each other and maybe helping each other take a deep breath. There's only so much you can do. Time, the great healer, hopefully. And so, yeah, we're looking forward to the rest of this year being a lot better.
Yeah, that's a positive way to look at it. And it's certainly given us a lot of perspective on life and the way life is right now. Thank you so much. Thanks, Ross, for ending off our coverage today.
Thank you.
Before we let go, we want to show you or tell you what the Prime Minister said in terms of a recap, so you have an idea of what the discussions will be around today. So today there was an extra $75 million in new funding for groups that address the critical needs of Indigenous people living both on and off reserves. And Trudeau was also asked about the potential second wave as the economy continues to reopen. And he said there is usually a second wave with pandemics. And again, the key here is testing. Thanks again for joining us. Hope you enjoy the beautiful weather and the part of the country you are in. We now return you to your regularly scheduled programming.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today we'll hear from Dr. Tam, who is Chief Public Health Officer of Canada, Dr. Nu, who is Deputy Chief Public Health Officer of Canada, Minister Miller, Minister of Indigenous Services Canada. We'll also have the opportunity of having Dr. Wong, who is Chief Medical Officer for Indigenous Services Canada. Dr. Tam.
Good afternoon and bonjour à toutes et à tous. I will start with the latest numbers on COVID-19 in Canada. There are now 80,555 cases, including 6,062 deaths. And 41,108 cases, or 51%, have now recovered. Labs across Canada have tested over 1,377,000 people for COVID-19 to date, with about 5% of these testing positive. We're currently testing an average about 28,000 people daily, and the numbers change quickly and are updated regularly on canada.ca/coronavirus. So, it's time to have the talk. That is the talk about what some refer to as quarantine fatigue. As things are beginning to reopen, we want to get out, but at the same time, many of us are still feeling trepidation. Is the time right? How do I keep myself and my family safe? These are valid concerns. COVID-19 has not gone away, and the struggle is not over. So we need to talk about the practices that will allow us to go out smart and stay safe. There are still uncertainties and lots more to learn, but there are things that we know now that will keep us safe, including that we need to proceed with caution. Since we're going to be living with COVID-19 for the foreseeable future, we'll need to pace ourselves and go out smart by remaining vigilant with public health measures to prevent the spread of the virus. And this includes physical distancing, 2 meters from others, keeps us far enough away to prevent coming into contact with potentially infectious droplets produced when people cough, sneeze, laugh, sing, or speak, including those who do not appear to be ill. Avoiding touching common surfaces and objects reduces the likelihood of contaminating our hands with infectious droplets, so avoiding touching our mouth, eyes, and nose stops us from infecting ourselves. Cleaning our hands, often with soap and water for 20 seconds, or with hand sanitizer while you are out and after you get back, destroys the virus, and make sure you don't inadvertently infect yourself or contaminate things you touch. Extra layers, like wearing a non-medical mask or face covering, where COVID-19 may still be active and you can't keep a 2-meter physical distance, provides additional protection to prevent spread of infectious respiratory droplets, even if the wearer is not showing symptoms. By continuing with tried and true public health measures, we can all get out safely and keep COVID-19 down. Thank you. Merci.
Merci, Dr. Tam. Dr. Nu?
Merci.
Thank you. Good afternoon. As usual, I will begin with the latest figures about COVID-19 in Canada. There are now 80,555 cases, incling 6,062 deaths, and 41,108 have now recovered. This is equal to 51% of the cases. Labs across Canada have now tested over 1,377,000 people for COVID-19, with about 5% of these testing positive. We are currently testing an average of 28,000 people every day. These numbers change quickly and are updated regularly on canada.ca/coronavirus. So it's time to have the talk. That's the talk about what some refer to as quarantine fatigue. As things are beginning to reopen, we want to get out. But at the same time, many of us are feeling trepidation. Is it the right time? How do I keep myself and my family safe? These are valid concerns. COVID-19 has not gone away, and the struggle is not over, so we need to talk about the practices that will allow us to go out smart and stay safe. There are still uncertainties and lots more things to learn. However, there are things we know now that will keep us safe, including that we need to proceed with caution. Since we are going to be living with COVID-19 for the foreseeable future, we'll need to pace ourselves and go out smart by remaining vigilant with public health measures to prevent the spread of the virus, and this includes the following measures. Physical distancing, 2 meters from others. This keeps us far enough away to prevent coming into contact with potentially infectious droplets. These droplets are produced when people cough, sneeze, laugh, sing, or speak, and this includes people who do not appear to be ill. Avoid touching common surfaces and objects. This will reduce the likelihood of contaminating our hands with infectious droplets. By avoiding touching our mouth, nose, and eyes, we will not infect ourselves. Cleaning our hands, often with soap and water for 20 seconds or with hand sanitizer while you're out and after you get back. This will destroy the virus and ensure that you don't inadvertently infect yourself or contaminate the things that you touch. Wearing a non-medical mask or face covering where COVID-19 may still be active and when you cannot keep a 2-meter physical distance will provide additional protection. This will help to prevent the spread of infectious respiratory droplets, even if the wearer is not showing symptoms. By continuing with tried and true public health measures, we will all get out safely and ensure that we can keep COVID-19 down. Thank you very much.
Merci, Dr. New.
Thank you, Dr. New.
Kwe Watkwanuaradu, Tanse Ulukut. Good afternoon, bonjour. Earlier today, the Prime Minister responded to the calls from urban Indigenous organizations across the country for more support and announced an additional $75 million for organizations supporting First Nations living off reserve and Inuit and Métis living in urban areas. Over the past 8 weeks or so, we've seen leadership at all levels to protect the most vulnerable, our elders and youth, and to take collective action to support those who need it most. Women's groups, homeless shelters, mental health supports, assistance with food delivery has been organized by community-based organizations across Canada. In March, we provided $305 million in immediate support through the Distinctions-Based Community Support Fund. This enabled First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities to address their specific needs as they prepared to react to the spread of COVID-19. To help respond to the pandemic, the fund included $15 million in support for Indigenous organizations that provide services to First Nations living off reserve or Inuit and Métis living in urban centres. Not only including major cities, but also smaller towns like Timmins, Ontario, or Prince George, BC. This funding helped 94 organizations supporting a variety of measures to help youth, homeless, and by providing food baskets, childcare, mental health supports, and sanitation and protective equipment. We've been able, for example, to support the important work of community-based groups like the Urban Native Youth Association, who is supporting Indigenous youth with self-isolation activity packages, technology, and education assistance, as well as financial support for frontline youth workers. We've also been able to support Iqaluit community Tukasiarkvik Society, who are providing Inuit elders with care packages of nutritious food and personal hygiene products, and the North Slave Métis Alliance, who is offering funding assistance to their members for essentials like groceries, prescription refills, and childcare expenses. Other funded initiatives are providing assistance in navigating and accessing the full range of government and community health, housing, and social supports, hiring emergency response coordinators, increased emotional support and wellness counseling, to name just a few examples. But this wasn't enough. We've also been able to fund organizations who are engaging Indigenous youth during this pandemic or are providing technology support in the form of internet connects for family computers or prepaid phone cards for elders, just to name a few. Today's announcement marks a 5-fold increase in the amount of funding for urban Indigenous organizations. And I want to take a brief moment to acknowledge the members of parliaments from all parties who pushed very, very hard for this announcement to happen. Since my
last update last week, the number of cases on Indigenous reserves is stabilizing. We saw 201 confirmed cases of COVID-19 on reserves. 156 have recovered. We can also confirm that the 16 cases in Nunavut, northern Quebec, have also recovered. By looking at the number of cases that have recovered, we know that the curve is flattening. These are encouraging results, and it suggests that a number of communities have stopped the spread of the infection. However, we must remain vigilant. We must continue to follow the situation closely.
We've unfortunately seen a steady increase in the numbers of confirmed cases in the Blood Tribe Alberta over the past few weeks. As of May 20th, there are a total of 13 cases in the community, and we are in close contact with the Blood Tribe Department of Health to support the community's pandemic response plan, mitigating further spread of the virus by screening, testing, and ensuring individuals self-isolate as appropriate. Initial contact tracing has shown some evidence of household transmission and extensive social interactions among individuals who have tested positive for the virus. While these individuals did not present severe cases of the virus, there is, of course, the potential for wider community spread. And I want to reiterate the importance of physical distancing, limiting social gatherings, and when possible, staying at home. Together, by making this conscious effort, we can slow the spread of COVID-19. As
the flooding season is ending and the forest fire season is beginning, we understand the additional complexities that COVID-19 will present in the case of an emergency evacuation. Indigenous Services Canada is continuing to work with the provincial and territorial governments and First Nations partners to put in place plans and emergency response plans that are efficient and that will guarantee the safety and security of all. To support these efforts, the 2019 budget that was announced of $48 million over 5 years, starting 2019-2020, and under the Fire Smart program, to support this capacity of First Nations to manage forest fires. This will continue and will help to ensure the resiliency of First Nations communities to deal with this growing threat.
Lastly, I would also like to add that the delivery of essential services and supplies in First Nation communities via charter flights continues, with the latest flight taking off yesterday, and to date 502 nurses and other healthcare providers have flown to or from 49 flying communities in Ontario, Manitoba, and Alberta. In addition to supporting the needs of the communities we serve, these flights also help keep communities, nurses, and our other healthcare professionals safe. Flights will continue every 4 weeks until it is safe to return to the previous process. In closing, I would like to once again thank all healthcare professionals working in Indigenous communities for their dedication and tireless efforts to ensure quality and culturally appropriate care, testing, and treatment during this pandemic. Miigwech, Nakumik, Marcy Cho. Thank you. Merci.
Merci, Marc. Merci tout le monde.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone. We are now very pleased to respond to your questions.
Thank you, Minister. So, as usual, we're going to proceed with the phone first. 3 questions on the phone, then we'll turn to the room. 1 question, 1 follow-up each. Operator, over to you.
Thank you. Merci. Our first question, notre première question, nous vient de Micheline Laflamme avec Radio-Canada. Please go ahead. À vous la parole. Merci. Bonjour.
Question.
Monsieur Miller, le fédéral
Mr.
a
Miller,
octroyé une
the
aide
federal
de
government gave
533 000 à Kanesatake
additional
pour
funding
l'aider à
to
faire face à la
Kanesatake to
crise.
deal with the
Et une
crisis.
partie de cet argent-là qui a été
Using
utilisé
this
pour payer
money,
les gens qui
which
gèrent
was
les contrôles
used to
routiers et
pay
qui
people
bloquent
who
l'entrée
were
du parc d'Oka.
managing the
Alors,
road
le
controls.
maire d'Oka, lui, dénonce le
The
fait
mayor
que
of
le
Oka
fédéral
has criticized the fact that
subventionne
the
des
federal government
blocages.
is
Alors, que
funding
lui
blockades.
répondez-vous?
What
Et
is your
est-ce que
response?
vous intervenez? Que faites-vous en ce moment pour
Will you
dénouer la
intervene?
crise
What
au
are you
parc d'Oka?
doing to deal with this crisis in the Oka Park? Mr. Miller's answer. First, I would say that it's difficult to judge people who are trying to protect their own community due to a spread of, or potential spread of COVID-19. I know that Indigenous communities have been exemplary in dealing with this very difficult situation. The money that was granted to Kanesatake as well as to other Indigenous communities across the country is being used to ensure the health and safety measures can be put in place to stop the spread, and to ensure that people can be safe and respect the guidelines set out. The health and medical advice that is being provided, far be it from me to judge how these communities are exercising their right. In Kanesatake, there are people who still speak their language. There are some 60 people who speak their language. These are very vulnerable people. So we must respect that sensitivity. Anytime an elder dies, it is tragic. We must understand the situation in which they are living. We're talking about security checkpoints along the roads. These are not barricades. There is a difference in the way that these checkpoints are being operated. If you had followed the news, in February, the federal government has indicated it could offer its services if requested. To date, the minister responsible has intervened and is in discussions with the mayor of Oka and Grand Chief Simon. These discussions are bearing fruit. If they need assistance, I will say that I am in constant contact with the minister, and they need only call. The government of Canada remains prepared to act if anything is needed, but they are managing the situation. And as you know, obviously, as I said earlier, if you had followed the situation in February, there is constant communication with these communities in order to resolve these different issues. Follow-up question. Thank you very much, Mr. Miller. My question goes perhaps to Dr. Tam or Dr. New. You will decide. President of the Canadian Medical Association, Dr. Sandy Buckman, said that the country is not prepared for a second wave and is concerned about the lifting of the current measures. There's a lack of medical staff. What do you think of this? What do we need to do? And do you agree? Thank you for the question. This is Dr. New. I cannot comment on the opinion of another individual, but I can tell you this. Dr. Tam and I continue to work closely with our counterparts in the provinces and territories and with all levels of government. Everyone understands that there may be a second wave, perhaps in the fall. We are working very hard to ensure that we have the supplies of equipment required and the human resources to do the contract tracing and enough vaccines for the seasonal flu. This is a current issue. We are continuing to work and prepare and plan. We want to be prepared for a second wave that perhaps might occur in a few months.
Thank you, Doctor. Operator, next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question nous vient de Jamie Pashagumscom with APTN. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Mill. Sorry. I'm wondering about the $75 million for urban Indigenous that you announced today. How will that money be divvied up? And specifically, will the CAP get its $16 million that it was asking for?
It's Jamie, right? Thanks for the question, Jamie. That $75 million will be divided up according to the submissions that we have received. As I had mentioned in a previous update, the $15 million that we had allocated was well oversubscribed, and so it is a question of allocating the remaining amounts, or even increasing current amounts that have been funded to organizations that are working on the front line to provide services to Indigenous peoples living in urban settings, increased amounts, and that's a decision that'll be taken within Indigenous Services Canada and rolled out in the most expedient fashion. I can't comment on the allocation as to any particular group that solicits funds. Obviously, we strive within the department to allocate these funds in an equitable fashion to serve those who need it most, in the most expedient fashion.
Jamie, follow up?
Yeah, thanks. You mentioned that obviously you've heard from CAP, but what assurances do you have that this is now going to be enough? Have you heard from other urban Indigenous organizations?
Well, it's hard really to comment on the sufficiency of funds that we allocate. We obviously looked at the profile of the amounts that were asked through a very open process that Indigenous Services Canada ran, and a very open submission process in a very short period of time, and noting that it was well oversubscribed. Obviously, it was an expression of need, but as I can't trace the outcome of the pandemic curve, or as to whether second or third waves will hit and where and how, it is difficult to say that will be sufficient. Certainly, this funding is one of the largest envelopes for the urban Indigenous space, noting that they are service providers that haven't been particularly well funded in the past. So it is a very significant amount, and whether it is sufficient or not isn't for me to decide. We'll have to constantly, and as the Prime Minister says, constantly reevaluate as we trace the course of the pandemic.
Thank you, Minister. Opérateur, prochaine question, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, prochaine question, nous vient de Michel Lamarche avec TVA. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Bonjour, c'est une question pour le ministre Duclos.
This question is for Minister Duclos. With regard to airlines, why is it that we cannot say today to consumers that they will be refunded, and that financial assistance requires refunds to consumers who purchase tickets? Thank you. There's three parts to the answer I will give. First, we fully understand the frustration of consumers in Quebec and across the country, people who bought tickets, made reservations, and paid, and now who are having trouble getting a refund. We also understand the very difficult situation in which airlines find themselves. We know that the short-term prospects for these airlines are quite modest and even of concern. Third, airlines should do everything they should and need to do to deal respectfully with their clients. If these companies want to reopen once the crisis has passed, they will need customers, and the way that they treat their customers now is essential. At the same time, to respond more directly to your question, I would say this. We are offering liquidity terms to companies, including airlines, in order to ensure they can keep their customers now, but also have some for later.
So we understand. I'll answer very briefly in English. So we understand fully the frustration that consumers in Canada have when it comes to getting their air tickets being reimbursed. This is a significant source of frustration for them, given that they have reserved and paid for their tickets. We also understand the difficult situation in which air companies everywhere on Earth, and in Canada in particular, are going through now and will be going through in the next while. So we know this is a crisis that is going to affect them for a little time. And third, we believe that they are best able and certainly expected to understand that if they want to have consumers in the future, they need to be treating them with respect. So given all of this, we also are offering these companies and many other companies ways to increase their liquidities and pay them emergency wages so that they can go through the crisis and work with their customers in the appropriate manner.
Michel, en suivi?
Bien sûr, pourquoi est-ce qu'on a
Supplementary
l'impression, en
question.
écoutant
Why,
l'absence de réponse, que
when
vous
we listen to
favorisez
the
les
lack of an
compagnies
answer,
aériennes
that you're
plutôt que les
favoring the
consommateurs
airlines
dans ce
rather than
territoire? Et je veux savoir
consumers?
pour les aînés, est-ce
And
qu'on
I'd
en
like
sait
to ask
plus
about
sur le moment
seniors.
où ils vont recevoir l'aide que
Will
vous leur
they
avez
get
annoncée la
the
semaine
assistance
dernière?
you announced last week? Answer. We understand that it's a difficult situation for everybody. It's an emergency that has a negative impact on many, many people, but also on companies. And we expect these companies, as I said a few moments ago, to treat fairly and respectfully their customers with regard to assistance for seniors. We are working quickly. The Minister said so last week that we hope that the major investments that will be made as quickly as possible, as well as ensuring that they are made properly, so there is no errors made in the payment of these funding.
We'll now turn to the room, starting with Julie Van Dusen from CBC.
Julie Van Dusen, CBC. Dr. Tam, considering all the complaints about testing, that not enough testing is being done across the country, can one assume that Canadians aren't getting the full story then on how many people are infected? In other words, the numbers you reveal every day, can one assume they're much higher?
I think throughout this epidemic, we know that the numbers will be higher than the people who actually got tested. So during the height of this epidemic, there would have been people who stayed at home or who had mild illness who would not have been tested. So at this phase, the strategy involves increasing testing in the community setting for people with even mild symptoms. Now, it's quite possible, and I know that I've heard from chief medical officers that, in fact, people are not necessarily showing up to get tested. Maybe they're not having symptoms, but there's also then needs to be more sort of systematic surveillance system set up to test different people in the community, particularly in high-risk settings. So I think that's part of the, obviously the strategy going forwards. All I can say is that, I think there is good collaboration with provinces and territories. Every level, as you've seen at the sort of very highest levels of government, people are seized with the need to increase laboratory capacity and testing. So I think as I think I mentioned yesterday, the key is to be able to jump on any increase in cases and do contact tracing really, really fast. So I think the other thing I would say is that that's why we have the immunity task force and the serologic testing, because we know that in the sort of there is a sort of bit of the iceberg underneath that we don't know about in terms of the true prevalence of the infection and who had previously been infected. So the serologic surveys or studies will help us sort of further understand what is the sort of proportion or percentage of the population that may be affected. And that has to be done across different areas of the country, in different age groups and in different settings as well.
Thanks. Now, I'm just wondering when you think the second wave is coming, and are you concerned it's going to be helped along by the fact that we've got everything happening now, the nice weather, things opening up, and a lot of Canadians talking about getting in their cars this summer and driving around?
So we've been messaging the importance to adhere to the core public health measures, because I think obviously this is quite a difficult period. I think it's one of the most difficult periods of the time where people have been observing these public health advice, and now some things are easing up, and there's sort of exuberance of maybe getting out there means that people may forget to do all the core public health measures. So it is very important that we keep reiterate these messages. And as I said, I might sound like a broken record, but I will be doing this all the time, because right now is not the time to forget those core public health measures, like the physical distancing, washing your hands, covering your cough, etc., and wearing a non-medical mask if you can't keep the 2-meter distance in a community where the virus may still be circulating. I think what will happen is that if we don't essentially clamp down on any sparks, the immunity in the population, we don't know the true immunity yet, or the true sort of infection rate, if you like, but it's not going to be that high. So there'll still be susceptible people. And if they reignite another chain of transmission, we have to jump on it really fast. This virus can accelerate really quickly. And so we've seen it accelerating really fast in that first wave. So we have to be really cautious, because it might not take much for another chain of transmission and an escalation to occur. Be it small waves that we clamp down, we really need to suppress those so that, again, it doesn't overwhelm the health system. Dr. New talked about, planning ahead for different scenarios, and one of them is planning ahead for the next fall-winter season, because usually respiratory viruses, we don't know enough about this coronavirus, but many respiratory viruses increase in the fall-winter time, including influenza itself. So some of the planning does include making sure we have enough influenza vaccine, making sure that continuously we increase our capacity. We're still acquiring ventilators, still building up our PPE capacity, the testing capacity. All of those things has to continue to increase so that we will be prepared for different scenarios, including even a bigger second wave.
Thank you, Doctor. Mr. McGregor.
Glenn McGregor, CTV News. Question for Dr. Tam, just following up on Julie's question. Some Canadians are considering flying this summer as well. I don't know if you've seen some of the pictures from inside airplanes recently, but there is pretty much a breakdown of physical distancing, especially when people are getting off the plane. Passengers sit one row after each other, not anywhere close to being 2 meters apart. I'm just wondering, do you think, considering airlines are federally regulated, that there needs to be tougher and more enforcement of standards on travel, air travel right now?
So that's a really good question, because right now, what's in place, of course, is screening before someone gets on a plane to Canada. At the federal level, Transport Canada has instituted mandatory wearing of non-medical masks on planes and other federally regulated transportation. Because it is fundamentally almost impossible on a plane, and sort of the corridors, etc. There's more, I think, being done by the associations for the airlines, and also to look at, there's also other measures inside the plane that you might be able to do in terms of how do people get to the washroom? How do you, do proper environmental cleaning? How do you protect both the staff and the travelers and the environmental cleaning aspects? Also, of course, we will be continuing the border measures in terms of making sure people go then into mandatory quarantine. Other countries have lots of measures. So any traveler flying somewhere else need to be very cognizant of what those are. You might actually have to be isolated for 14 days somewhere else. So be prepared for all of those things. But I think that this is actually a very active piece of discussion in that sector. As in all businesses, Chief Markov is advising people to have a plan and let us see what that is. So I think that sector is trying to pull together all the different elements of the layers of protection that it needs to, in order for traveler confidence, I think, to be built up. But from a public health perspective, we are pretty extremely vigilant about this because the virus has traveled to every country in the world. There's different activities still in different countries. We don't want that importation to occur. So it's both for traveler protection going out there and for people sort of coming back in. You would expect that level of vigilance and screening and isolation to continue. But of course, I will say that we'll have to keep evaluating these things on an ongoing basis. And I know that I'm not sure if Minister Duclos or others will talk about this, but obviously interdepartmentally, there's lots of conversations about how to safely look at air travel, or actually other forms of travel as well.
Thank you. Follow-up for Minister Duclos. You mentioned the difficulties the airlines are having. One of those challenges is that airlines are federally regulated under the Canada Labour Code, which can be more onerous in some cases, especially dealing with terminations of employees. Have you given any consideration, your government given any consideration to relaxing or waiving any of the provisions of the code so that airlines can respond more agilely to the crisis they're facing right now?
Well, that question is not only important, but of course would be best placed to my colleague, Minister Tassi. What I can say, however, is that our top priority is the health and safety of workers. We do feel and do understand that many companies, including air companies, go through difficult times. But protecting the health and safety of their workers is absolutely essential. So while we believe that there are extra costs to doing this, we also are offering all sorts of different support to make sure that not only is this the government's priority, but also the priority of businesses.
Thank you, Minister. Mike?
Hello, Mr. Duclos. So municipalities are talking about cuts from everything to arenas and pools to essential services like fire and police. Will the federal government, either on its own or in collaboration with the provinces, provide the $10 to $15 billion that is being requested by the FCM?
Very good. Well, Minister Freeland just yesterday and Prime Minister Trudeau a couple of times in the last few days as well have repeatedly said that we are fully mindful of the difficulties that cities and municipalities go through in Canada. And we are therefore hearing them. We are ready to help them. However, this has to be absolutely in collaboration and with the full support of provinces and territories. So this discussion is ongoing and we look forward to continue it.
Thank you, Minister. We're now going to turn back to the phone. Operator?
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question, nous vient de Hélène Buzetti avec Le Devoir. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Oui, bonjour. Ma question serait pour le ministre Miller. J'aimerais revenir à la question de ma collègue posée précédemment concernant le contrôle routier proche d'Oka.
The checkpoints, the road checkpoints near Oka. I understand what you said about security, but in your opinion, are these checkpoints legitimate? Answer.
Hélène, depuis le début, en ce qui a trait aux communautés autochtones,
from the beginning, when it comes to Indigenous communities, it was important to ensure the relationship with the federal government to ensure that health and safety protocols were in place, with resources, funding resources to support this. Obviously, you know the relationship the federal government has with Indigenous communities. If we want self-government, we must respect the choices being made. I have said this to your colleague. Indigenous communities have been exemplary. We see the proof of this when it comes to the number of infections and the measures that have been taken in these communities to ensure that if there was an outbreak, it was stopped with the aggressive intervention and health measures put in place with, let's be frank, limited resources. They have rich histories and vulnerable individuals living in these communities. The chiefs, band councils is concerned in particular with these elders. When you talk about 60 people remaining who speak a language, you have to be careful. They have put in roadblocks, checkpoints at Oka and Ganastake. It's not a barricade. We're not talking about a crisis. We know what it is. And if you follow the news from February, you would see this kind of situation as the economy reopens will perhaps be repeated across the country. But we must remember that with our provincial partners and municipal partners, we're going to ensure there is a dialogue and the full respect for the health of individuals. I have been in contact with the chiefs, Minister d'Amour, and the latest news that I had was that things were being resolved, but we're not talking about a dispute when it comes to the health and well-being of individuals and a desire to protect those very vulnerable individuals. Far be it from me from judging the way in which these communities choose to implement the health protocols. We must continue the dialogue, of course. And the latest news that I had was that this was a situation that was being resolved. Supplementary question. I understand what you're saying, but you're not really answering the question. Do they have the authority to do this? The mayor says, for example, I did not go myself to this place, but is it blocking access to the village? Do they have the authority to put up these checkpoints where they're putting them and slow down or prevent circulation or traffic to these areas? Answer. These are checkpoints that were set up, if I understand, with regard to the situation. They were set up with the mayor. This is something that has become gotten a lot of media attention, and there is a judgment being made about the way that people are acting to protect the most vulnerable members of their community. I don't have an opinion on this. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question nous vient de Dylan Robertson with the Winnipeg Free Press. Please go ahead, à vous la parole.
Hi there. A question for Minister Miller. I'm wondering how the funding is going to be rolled out, if you're going to be dipping into the past application pile under the original $15 million fund. And of that fund, what was the total number of applications and the sum of funds that were requested?
Well, thank you, Dylan, for the question, and I'll elaborate a bit on what I told to Jamie. We did receive, as part of the allocation of the initial $15 million pot, dozens and dozens of applications, a number of them expressing an incredible need to serve the Indigenous population, principally in urban settings, which does form about half of the population of Canada that is Indigenous. We are going to look at the pot of applications that came in. Obviously, the situation has changed. So as we look at how to allocate in an equitable fashion, we'll have to reflect the fact that those applications came in weeks ago and the situation in Canada has changed and there may be different needs in different communities. The most crying example, obviously, is the funding that we provided to La Loche to address a very, very alarming outbreak in that area to the Métis of Saskatchewan, working with Treaty 10 Indigenous groups. And so that is something that we'll have to reevaluate, reassess. We haven't allocated those funds yet. It was just announced this morning, and I can't tell you the total number of applications. I can tell you that the former pot of $50 million was oversubscribed by many factors. I would say 6, 7, 8, but I would have to go back and look and see if that is a number that we would provide to you.
Dylan, follow up. Thank you. Thank you. And Minister Duclos, we have no precise data on the wage subsidy or the CERB. Your departments are publishing overall data, but we have experts who are asking for a breakdown by province, by week, by gender, so that the provinces and some of the experts and nonprofits can help shape their responses. I'm just wondering why we don't get more precise data on these programs.
Well, that's an excellent question. First, I would perhaps want to give those numbers that I have in front of me. So for CERB, it's a total of 8.1 million applicants that have received at least one payment. A total of 14.3 million payments made for the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. As of recently, a total of 243,000 businesses have been found eligible, and payments for the first period, that is May 15th to April the 12th, these payments cover the wages of 2.1 million workers. And I would add quickly for CEBA, the Canadian Emergency Business Account, the $40,000 emergency loans for small businesses. So a total of 616,000 small businesses have received those emergency loans. But second, I do agree that more disaggregated data would be useful and helpful, especially in the context of journalists like you who have a duty of informing Canadians. And I will talk to my colleagues and see how we can provide those data.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre. Opérateur, dernière question, s'il vous plaît. Last question.
Thank you. Merci. Our last question, la dernière question, nous vient de Lina Dib avec la presse canadienne. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Oui, bonjour.
My first question is for you, Mr. Miller. I'd like to understand why it took you 2 months before this assistance for Indigenous peoples living in urban areas and off-reserve was announced, given the situation, the growing situation I can see from outside my window, so to speak. And could you provide the answer in both English and French?
Merci, Lina.
Thank you, Lina.
The
underfunding of Indigenous peoples living in urban areas and off-reserve is something that has happened often in the past.
Avec les nations autochtones, c'est avec des entités de gouvernance, des conseils de bande dans la plupart des cas, ou à travers les territoires en ce qui a trait à nos relations avec les Inuits. Et plus récemment,
most recently, we have also funding for Métis people. These are relationships that have developed as nation to nation. We have funding, pre-existing funding envelopes of different types.
En ce qui a trait à la juridiction, d'abord, qui est très nette et claire, c'était
with regard to jurisdiction, it was clear.
Il fallait absolument intervenir et donner les ressources financières nécessaires.
Financial resources had to be provided to the most vulnerable Indigenous communities, and this would allow them to deal with potential outbreaks of COVID-19 in their communities. And this is what we did. We've known for a long time that Indigenous peoples living in urban areas was present. There are organizations and services with which we didn't have very well developed relationships. And they're not the same kinds of governance associations as we would have with other groups. They're quite different. So what we wanted to do was to reserve 15 million of the envelope that we had provided for the First Nations, Inuit and Métis peoples to prepare. And I would tell you that it was insufficient. I'm from Montreal, and I see this every day in my own city. Obviously, we knew that people were falling through the cracks, and we reacted quickly to release funding to a number of communities and organizations which spoke out about the need for funding. We acted quickly. If we could have done better, together. Well, we'll take a look at that, but these funds will be made available to meet the urgent needs.
I will try to repeat what I just said in French. Indigenous Services Canada and the underfunding from a federal perspective, provincial perspective, or a municipal perspective of urban Indigenous groups is something that has been going on for a long time. These are vulnerable groups that exist, and the organizations that serve them serve some of the most vulnerable in society. They have been underfinanced for a long time by every level of government. It's not something that to be particularly proud of, obviously, but we note it. We knew going into this pandemic that we needed to deploy money, resources, physical or otherwise, into communities. The relationship that Indigenous Services Canada has for a long time from a nation-nation perspective deals with governments, entities, in communities, in nations, most often banding council. So that was a funding stream with a different level of maturity and nature than we have and have had historically at Indigenous Services Canada, and indeed from the entirety of government. So we wanted to get that amount out early to those communities. We knew, and that jurisdiction and line of jurisdiction, as I said in French, is quite clear. It is the federal government's duty. It is the Crown obligation to serve those communities. Now, knowing that 50% of the Indigenous communities lives in the urban setting and the jurisdiction of the provinces and municipalities, there is a level of complexity that exists, and there are Indigenous communities and service providers that have fallen through the gap, and they have unique needs that need to be reflected, particularly in a pandemic such as COVID-19. The amounts that we reserve, the $15 million that we reserved, was funded through some of the relationships that we have with the web of friendship centres that Indigenous Services has a relation with. But we knew by opening up an ask process that we would get many more demands than we could fulfill for the $15 million amounts that we had reserved and set aside. That required some work internally and some advocacy to ensure that we had the funds necessary to distribute a much larger amount that we know, and it's in the spirit of not leaving anyone behind. When it comes to our duty towards Indigenous peoples, that is something where the government has stepped up, and these funds are indeed the largest, I believe, allocation of funds to those service providers that I know in any recent memory. So it's something that is still needed and will serve to protect those that are the most vulnerable. And whether we could have done better is something that we'll have to re-examine at a later date.
Lina, en suivi?
Supplementary question. My last question is for you, Mr. Duclos. Earlier we heard Trudeau talking to businesses that are not handling well the wage subsidy or commercial rents. Do you understand why entrepreneurs are not doing what you want them to do? What can you do to fix this situation? Answer. I would say the key word here is uncertainty. We're thinking in particular of the emergency wage subsidy, which was announced a few weeks ago. Companies didn't really understand the situation in which they found themselves. They did not know the nature of the program because it was the first time in the history of the country that the government had moved forward with this kind of initiative. So it took some time for companies to understand how to deal with the new program and make it fit to the circumstances, the complicated circumstances in which many of these companies found themselves now with the announcement of the extension, the 3-month extension, 12 weeks, that goes to the end of August of this Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy Program. There are many more companies that are beginning to understand how to make this federal aid help them deal with the relaunch. That was the goal from the beginning. It was to ensure that, yes, we would help workers who lost their jobs, and we would maintain, to the extent possible, the jobs, and we would help companies take advantage of this wage subsidy to reopen. So this is somewhat the reasons for this. Last week with the announcement, we feel that the program will be fully taken up. Thank you, ministers. That ends the press conference.